Thank you for joining us for the final episode of this webinar series for now, Nurturing Seeds of Peace. The series has been hosted by the International Dialogue Center and the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. I see that folks have already started introducing themselves in the chat, so feel free to continue to do so. My name is Kate Soulis, and I've been the moderator for all of these sessions. I'm the executive director of the Religion and Education Collaborative and a religious literacy consultant and researcher primarily focusing on schools and education. Today, I'm going to be talking with Daniel Del Nido about how religious literacy can foster inclusion and respectful engagement in classrooms and learning spaces. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Kate. Very glad to be here, and thank you to the International Dialogue Center for hosting these conversations. It's been really great.
Can you start out with giving us a little bit of context for your work and then maybe a couple of concrete examples of how you see religious literacy in action?
Yeah, absolutely. So the organization that I work for is the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. And we're a nonprofit organization that's based in New York City. And our mission is to promote justice and build respect for religious difference. As an organization, we do that in a number of different fields and institutions, in healthcare fields, in workplaces across the globe, in sort of international peace building settings, and in the education sector. And that's where the education program that I work for is, mostly located. But we do a lot of work in, providing training and curricula for people in workplaces or in healthcare settings or in education. So thinking about the work that I do, primarily with schools, sometimes with individual teachers, sometimes with school districts, we're really focused on building lasting behavioral change. So the overall, goal of the education program is for K through 12 age students. So in the United States, that's roughly like ages 5 through 18, to build behaviors of respect for difference, including religious difference. And we do that by providing, written curricula and lesson plans for teachers, by providing training and professional development for educators, and by running a teacher network of teachers who are committed to religious literacy education with a focus on inclusivity. The specific example that I want to talk about of religious literacy in action is kind of an interesting one, and one that I've thought about over the past couple of years. It comes from a teacher that we worked with for a few years on our education advisory board. That's our teacher network. And he taught high school at a Jewish day school in the Detroit metropolitan area in the state of Michigan. And he taught a number of different courses, including a history elective on the modern Middle East for 10th graders. And so this course addressed, the history of the region and a number of different conflicts, including highly sensitive conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when this teacher was working with us, he said that he really wanted his students to work on addressing complex issues with sensitivity. That he really wanted to focus on having them build empathy and the ability to take in multiple perspectives when engaging with difficult topics like conflicts or sensitive topics. So we worked with him to integrate conflict resolution and transformation skills and connection with religiously motivated peacemakers into his curriculum for this class. So this involves things like adding profiles of religiously motivated peacemakers who are employing their religious beliefs and their communities to address and transform conflicts in a number of different settings, including in the Middle East. Some of these also involved sort of skill building for the students. So we wanted to give students an opportunity to practice the skills that they saw these religiously motivated peace actors using in their work. And the story he told us, this is a couple months after we started working with him, he told us about a baseball game that happened at his school. He was also the head coach of the school's baseball team. And his team was winning a very lopsided game. against another school, and players on the other team were getting kind of angry. And this is the kind of situation where things can get quite nasty or fights can break out. And what amazed him was that he saw students in his modern Middle East class using the de-escalation techniques that they learned in that class to resolve this situation and to resolve it peacefully and to sort of lower the temperature on the field. And I really like this anecdote for a couple of reasons, actually. One is that it really shows the importance, I think, of curricular and pedagogical design in a way that connects both content knowledge about peacemaking and the role of religion in peacemaking, especially in case studies, with actual sort of skill building and application for students, and to show how they can use the knowledge that they're gaining in the class. It makes for, I think, a much more meaningful experience and lasting experience for the students. There's also a focus on skills here, right? This teacher had a specific behavioral goal for his students: build empathy, take others' perspectives when thinking about conflict situations. And so, we designed the course and he designed his curriculum around that goal. And the last thing I like about this anecdote is that it shows the transferability of skills that are developed in religious literacy education. It's really fascinating and rewarding to see that even in moments where religion is not obviously connected to a particular situation, a conflict situation, a social situation, the skills and knowledge acquired in religious literacy education can still be relevant and can, help students, help, youth engage in these situations. And I think it's a helpful way for us to start this conversation and thinking about when we are training and educating youth for religious literacy, we're doing so not just for their classrooms or for something immediate, but for any number of the contexts that they might, enter into, both, in their lives as students and as adults.
This is something that we've talked about across all of the webinars, is that religious literacy is so context specific. And what you're talking about is shaping that content and skills to fit that specific context, and then being able to see how the students are expanding that, taking that outside of the classroom. When you start working with a new school or a new district or teacher, how do you figure out what you need to do to understand that context and shape what you're going to work with that particular school on?
That's a great question. So I think it involves a couple of different things. One is to understand the populations, within that school and the communities, around that school or that teacher or even within that district, to understand what the sort of state of religious and cultural diversity looks like in that, in that area. And then to get a sense from a variety of stakeholders, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second, about what the culture of the institution is like, what they think they need to work on, where they see their strengths, where they see sort of fault lines within the community. And so when I say sort of stakeholders, it's part of our theory that the climate in which children learn is shaped by a number of different sort of inputs, if you will, into a sort of ecosystem. There's the students themselves and their interactions. There's what they're taking from teachers, educators in formal education settings, but also what's happening in that broader school community, what's happening in the hallways and in the cafeteria, right, and in the bus ride, right? And so there's also sort of administration and staff to think about there. And then there's also parents and the larger community. And so we try to engage all of these stakeholders as much as is possible in order to get a rich sense of the community's needs. And so we spend a lot of time on needs assessment and, try to offer opportunities for like surveys or interviews to get a sense of what the community needs. And then we try to identify a leader or a couple of leaders in some of those different communities who we can really focus on in our training work, under the idea that, even when we might be done with a partnership with a school or a school district, there's somebody who can carry on the work. And so we like to, try to find those kind of change agents within the school. And we shape our intervention, whatever that might be, whether it's written resources or trainings or workshops around that.
I really like this approach, and it's very deliberate and holistic. What are some of the challenges that you've faced or pushback that you've gotten from different stakeholder groups?
Yeah, also a great question, an important one, because you can get various forms of either hesitancy or resistance from different stakeholders in different ways. When it comes to, for example, educators themselves, we often hear that from educators that they don't feel prepared to address these issues. There wasn't adequate pre-service training, or that they don't feel like they have the background knowledge in religion to address these issues responsibly. When it comes to administrators, say, there's a worry about sort of parent pushback or community pushback, the idea that we're addressing issues that are sort of too sensitive for this community to engage with. And from parents as well, they want to understand what our motivations are, what our sort of background and sort of philosophy is when we work with that community. So, there can be resistance or just hesitancy from a number of different sectors. And I should also mention, sometimes when we work with schools, the sort of non-teaching, non-administrative staff, so, people like environmental service workers or people who work in, in the lunch counter, right? They'll sometimes say that this might not be relevant to me, right? I don't need to know this. And I think that just the overall, there's not like one strategy that's going to work with all of these groups, but I always try to err on the side of more transparency and to try to bring people on as partners and give them a role in building the proper learning environment, building that welcoming learning environment for the students.
You
Yeah.
mentioned that teachers, the educators, often worry that they don't have the adequate training or content knowledge. I found that oftentimes when you go into an educational context and say, oh, we are here to bring religious literacy, there's this assumption that that means you need to know all the facts. Like
Yeah.
you need to learn this huge
Yes.
body of content knowledge about religions. Yet, as scholars of religion, we know that we're never going to know all of those facts.
Yeah.
So how do you help the educators understand that it's not about knowing the content knowledge, it's about knowing how to learn about the content knowledge?
Yeah. You absolutely hit it on the head that, we engage with teachers and there is this belief that, okay, there's this long list of religious traditions and I need to learn this set of facts and histories and texts from each one of them. And, what I'll start by saying is that, like, look, I have a PhD in religious studies and there is so much I don't know. I cannot even begin to tell you about all the things I don't know. And so what we try to focus on are things like inquiry, learning how to ask the right questions and find the right information. So it is sort of a mindset shift for educators who often want to feel like they're sort of in command of the material, understandably, but to recognize that this field is so vast that it's not possible for one person or even a team of people to become master of the material. So to focus more on learning how to ask questions, learning where to find the information that you want to find, and then to develop more sort of disciplinary literacy, to think about how to engage with content knowledge when you're teaching it. And so one way that I think is really helpful, and this kind of goes back to that earlier anecdote, is to focus on case studies. and to give the opportunity for educators and for students to work through these case studies, because that will give them the sort of analytic and inquiry experience that they can transfer to other situations. So instead of trying to offer that like broad, 30,000 feet above ground overview of, Buddhism, say, to look at a particular community, how they live out their, religious identities, and to use the sort of skills they build in that to apply to other situations.
You talked earlier about in your needs assessment, learning about the community who's represented in that community. And I imagine that you probably use that at times to help educators prioritize what they might want to put their energy into learning a little bit more detail about. For instance, I used to live in a town that had a very significant Jewish population. And so if I worked with educators in that town, I would ask them to prioritize, learning about different Jewish traditions, and maybe not put as much energy into learning about Hinduism right away because they don't have as many Hindus. It's not something that they're encountering so frequently. Not to say that they shouldn't learn about Hinduism, but we all have to prioritize. And so thinking about where's your energy best spent in this immediate moment.
Right. Yeah, it's a matter, I think, of prioritizing your learning objectives. So with that, with the needs assessment, one of the things that, and you're absolutely right, these can become teaching tools in their own right, and quite illuminating teaching tools, actually. One of the things that often comes out is that people don't realize just how diverse their community actually is. There can be an assumption among communities that there's a certain degree of homogeneity, and that, once you really dig in, you find not just that sort of diversity between religious identities, but diversity within different religious identities. So just because a group of people identifies as Jewish or Christian, they don't necessarily believe the same things, practice the same way, have the same kind of communities. And sometimes that's one of the first opportunities for people to see religious diversity in their community, and not just as something sort of abstract, out there in the world, but here and now. And so to open up their thinking to seeing what's there in their community, that opens up, as you say, like avenues to other investigations into the diversity of, to religious diversity in the world.
That's so valuable because schools and districts collect so much data about their students and staff and educators, but one of the things that they don't collect any data about is the religious identity of the
Mm.
population. One of the unique aspects of the US education system. And so a school might be very familiar with all of the other data that they have, but this is data that they've never seen before.
And so what results from that is that the religious makeup of a school or a community can often be invisible to them before, they step back and take the time to really investigate and dig in.
The other thing that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to come back to was the importance of religious literacy for all of the people in the school not in the classroom or not teaching. So you talked about people who work in the cafeteria, library, school nurses, all of those very important members of the community who might not otherwise be involved in this kind of professional development.
Mm.
When I was doing research on teacher learning about religious diversity, one of the participants in my study was a school nurse. And I was
Mm.
kind of intrigued because I wasn't, the participants in the study ended up being far more diverse in terms of school roles than I'd expected. And talking to the school nurse about, you know, why she participated and then what she got out of it was really fascinating. And just all of the the ways that she was able to use that learning to better connect with the students she worked with, the families, understand religious perspectives on health. So, do you ever work with, that group specifically, or is everybody integrated? How do you make it so apparent that like everybody needs to know about this and not just say the history teachers?
Yeah. One of we did a PD, a professional development, a couple of years ago with a group of school social workers. In a lot of like American public schools, social workers have like sort of mental health roles or other sort of like, social and emotional engagement roles with students. So they're often not in the classroom, but if a student is experiencing, an issue of some sort, they're having some problem in the school, the school social worker will be the person that they go to. And one of the things that I think came out of that conversation was really valuable is that religious literacy helps you understand the person who you're engaging with at a deeper level. And again, it's not just about their stated religious identity or affiliation or lack thereof. It's how they live their lives. And the more sort of like deep and fine-grained your investigation, your sort of religious literacy investigation and inquiry is, the more you can find out about another person and what matters to them and how the actions they take, the sort of habitual actions they take on a daily basis that forms their sense of self. And so when we work, especially with these, outside of the classroom, populations, that sort of interpersonal piece is what we try to focus on, is that, by learning this aspect of people and being able to talk about it with them respectfully, you open up a whole new area of engagement and the ability to, talk to another person and have a meaningful conversation with them and to address issues when they come up. It might be the case that it's someone in the cafeteria who's engaging, with a conflict situation, and it could be helpful for them to understand how to sort of inquire into how people's identities say are informing that conflict situation.
Right. Religion isn't confined to the history classroom or the literature classroom. Students, educators, staff, everybody brings their religious identity and experience with them, whether they're in the library or the cafeteria, in the hallways. And so it's so important for the whole school community to recognize that.
I do think that we need to do more in terms of empirical research into this. There is some empirical research onto the effectiveness of, religious literacy initiatives. I'm thinking of the course in Modesto, California, or in there's also research that comes out of Quebec into the effectiveness of various interventions. But I do think that there needs to be more. When we work with schools or school districts, we try to think about it, as you say, sort of both quantitatively and qualitatively. One thing that we do, we'll give this to, schools and also to the teachers who work with us in our network of inclusive educators, is are sort of pre and post surveys that address a number of issues related to religious literacy. These are primarily aimed at their students, but there are some for, the teachers themselves, thinking about, how well they understand their own background, right? Like the meaning of the holidays they celebrate, their practices, their values, things about, learning about others and their curiosity towards others. The surveys can involve, how to recognize when someone is being mistreated for their religious identity, and the knowledge and willingness to engage in that kind of a moment. And one way that we, conduct sort of impact analysis is by seeing the change, from beginning to end. And then we try to, again, in as much as is possible, to keep giving the survey, a few months out, or afterwards, to see just how kind of sticky these skills are. So that's one way that we use. I think another thing, and this is more sort of qualitative, is to help teachers or administrators or your parents as well identify behaviors that they're looking for. And so to, you know, and to really be able to kind of like be specific and almost like visualize these behaviors. Think about, for example, if we want to build curiosity in students, okay, what does that actually look like in practice? That might look like a student asking, being able to phrase a respectful question, or if they come across something that they don't understand, to ask about it instead of sort of immediately passing judgment on it, right? So we try to work with them to identify the specific behaviors that they want to see, as to demonstrate impact. And so that's more of like a sort of qualitative way of thinking about it.
Yeah, this is a question that I also really love. This is an area that I am very passionate about, and the need for more research on the impact of religious literacy education in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges I see in measuring impact is that it's often very hard to predict where you might see those impacts pop up in the future.
Yeah.
You shared the story at the beginning about how it showed up in a baseball game.
Yeah.
I had a student who was one of those students who was always very quiet. You never were sure if you were getting through to her. And a year after she had left my school, she was an eighth grader when I had her, and she moved on to high school. She sent me an email back saying, thank you so much for teaching me about Islam. I have a new Muslim friend in my new school, and we went to the mosque together this weekend, and I never would have said yes to that if we hadn't learned about Islam previously. So, a student that you would never have predicted would be the one reaching out to tell you about the impacts. So this just makes it very challenging because we don't want to really measure that content knowledge. It's those skills, those behaviors, and trying to think about what are some proxy measures that we can use to try and think about behavioral change, attitudinal change.
I think there's a number of ways to kind of address that question. One is about the value of the non-devotional academic study of religion. And this kind of gets us into what Kate and I were just talking about in terms of like the difficulties of empirically measuring it. But in terms of the overall goals that we have and that you can sort of see, they fall into a number of different areas. One is about sort of civic participation and the ability to understand and engage with issues, political or social issues, where religion is a component in a way that's, informed and responsible and empathetic. And there's other ways to think about it, think about that impact more sort of like behaviorally and interpersonally, right? To say that students can engage these difficult situations, these conflict situations, in a more, again, sort of empathetic and sensitive way, with religious literacy education. I think another piece, though, is, we were talking earlier about the other contexts of religious literacy, right? In places like workplaces or in healthcare. In some of the earlier conversations in this series about the, international diplomacy sectors or sort of civic engagement sectors. I think another way to make that case for religious literacy education and this sort of specifically academic instruction of religion is to hear from these groups and to hear from these sectors about why this kind of education and the skills of religious literacy are important for these sectors. So I guess I don't know, that's how I think about that question, and thinking about having this distinction between academic and devotional understanding of religion. And then there's a whole set of questions about like how that's done sort of in practice, but another piece of it is how we make the case for it and show that it is valuable to do so.
And that last thing you said about making the case for it, I think that that's so important, and something that you and I have talked about a lot is how do we make the case for religious literacy? And from kind of the modern emergence of this as a field, a lot of it has been, you know, there's violence, there's bullying, there's
Yes.
conflict. In order to solve those problems and prevent all these negative things, we need religious literacy. But what you and I have talked about a lot is how do we shift that narrative to focus on the positive value, that civic engagement, the conflict resolution before we're responding to a conflict, so that we're taking a more proactive approach instead of saying, oh, there's a problem, let's solve it. Let's put the things in place ahead of time so those problems don't emerge.
Right, so that schools or teachers or school districts are equipped to engage with them when they occur. And so, yeah, like, excuse me, so often, and this is something I hear not just, for us, but for many people working in the field, is that they get a call after something bad has happened. So there's, something happening in the world, or some incident that occurred in the school, and some harm has already been done. And that's when the intervention is called for. And that's inevitable, of course. That's going to happen. And there's, we're glad to get that call. And I mean, not glad that it occurred, but glad that they're addressing it in a robust way. But I think that we also want to, as you say, shift that conversation towards the proactive, equipping or, inoculation, if you will, of schools and school communities so that they're prepared.
Right. That, like you said, the building those skills ahead of time so that hopefully when that incident occurs, the people on the ground are already equipped to respond and it doesn't escalate, and then they don't need to call you because they've already engaged with you.
Right, right.
Yep.
It can start in early childhood. So I think it can start in, what we talk about, like K through 12, but there's also pre-K and then even 3K. So like students as young as 3. Now, and I think that when we engage with those sort of early childhood populations, the conversation is different, right? Like it's about thinking about what I do with my family, and then starting to connect that to other people. And young children at that age really like to make those comparisons, really like to be able to share about the things they do as a family, and so to sort of start the conversation that way. And so I think that it can be as early as 3K or pre-K, certainly early childhood. When it comes to family and community buy-in, I think that there's a couple ways of approaching that. One is, sort of as we were saying before, to engage with the families and communities proactively and to be transparent about the goals for any religious literacy program, not just one that occurs in early childhood, but but later on. And one thing that, especially with this younger group, that we've seen when we've worked with teachers who are doing sort of early childhood to younger elementary, is that students will go home and ask their parents questions about, why do we do this thing? Why do we celebrate this holiday? Why do we, go to this community, right? And that, when that happens, like that curiosity shows, that sort of builds the buy-in from the parents and families when they see their child generating more sort of curiosity and engagement with their own sort of identities and communities. That really generates that sort of goodwill.
We have a colleague who teaches high school, and he generates parent buy-in by offering parent classes. So once a month or so, he'll offer an evening seminar for parents on whatever topic their students are learning about, so that the parents are able to engage their children in conversation. And I would be really curious to see what that might look like for parents of younger children,
Yeah.
equipping them to be able to answer some of those questions, because kids have strange questions sometimes, or really hard questions sometimes,
Yeah.
and you never know what they're going to come up with. And so if in a culture where we're kind of trained not to talk about religion in public,
Yeah.
and oftentimes even very much at home, like starting that culture of you can ask questions, we can find answers together is a really good way to get the parents to have that buy-in, so that if kids are used to talking about this from a young age, then they'll be even more prepared to do a more in-depth study when they get to middle or high school.
Yeah, and to communicate also that there aren't any dumb questions. That, so often, and this is true just across the board, people are so worried about getting something wrong or making a mistake, looking like they don't know or that they're ignorant. And that has that kind of chilling effect where they just don't want to engage the issue because they're so worried about making a mistake and potentially embarrassing themselves. And that's true of the teachers as much as anyone else. And so that's part of why we want to inculcate this mindset that everyone is a learner when it comes to religion. Your students are a learner, and you, the teacher, are a learner, and that's okay. We're all learning together. There's not like a bright line where religious literacy starts and stops, right? Religious literacy education starts and stops. And so there is some overlap between these two things. What I think is, um, I think the first thing is to say that, like, when we have this distinction between the sort of academic and devotional study of religion, or teaching religion versus teaching about religion, right, we have sort of specific goals in mind when we're doing that at school. And we're trying to prepare children to engage with others. We're trying to help them understand what's happening in the world in a deeper, richer way. And so the sort of goals of instruction differ, right? It's not about sort of, exploring your own sort of spiritual life or attachment, or deepening a sense of like identity. And so there can be some perceived conflict, right? And there can be suspicion even of, when schools engage in this kind of education. I think one sort of data point that does come out of the uh, empirical research that exists is that there can sometimes be a fear that when students learn about other religious traditions, they will detach from their own, right? They'll become less attached to their own identity, and that has not shown up in the data. In fact, what has shown up, this is particularly from Modesto, is that students are more curious. They're more curious about their own identities, right? And so I think this is the kind of place where, one, that research can be really valuable, but two, it's an area for communication with parents to say that, in communities, that, like, yes, we are teaching for specific purposes, and that we want to be very clear about what those purposes are. And that's not something that is in conflict with what is happening at the home.
I'm so glad you brought up that research about students often becoming more engaged in their own religious tradition when they start learning about religion in school. And that's an area where I think we need a lot more research, because this is a continual concern among parents and communities, that if students learn about something that's different from themselves at school, they're going to be either you know stop believing in what they are taught at home, or be tempted to convert to another
Yeah.
religious tradition because it looks fun and exciting. And we have some but not enough data to help really support that idea that no, this is a way to help students learn how to then apply those skills to learning more about their own religious tradition and identity, and maybe making parents aware that your child might be coming home with more questions about your own tradition,
Yeah.
and like be prepared to start discussing this more, but it's not because they're necessarily going to reject it. They just are realizing that there's more questions that you can ask than you might otherwise be exposed to within your religious community. I'm realizing that we are definitely beyond our time. Uh, we could obviously talk about this for hours, and we
We're just
do.
getting started.
Yeah. But we won't keep our participants any longer today. So thank you so much for joining us today. This is the last webinar in this series, but we have had lots of interest, and there will likely be more conversations coming in the future. So stay tuned.
Thank you all for coming today and for your questions.